What is up, guys? It's Dr. Cellini here, and on today's episode I wanted to continue with my kind of like a series on how to level up through the veterinary system, going from being a student getting into vet school, and the next step in that process obviously being an internship. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about how to get into a rotating internship. What is an internship? What does it do for you? And what that experience is like. I've actually done 2 internships myself. I thought I would make this video from our Airbnb here in Kauai during our Cellini family vacation, mainly because I couldn't think of anything more opposite of an amazing vacation than an internship. All right, let's get started. As you can see, I'm on vacation today, but I've got some downtime before the rest of the family gets ready. Dr. Cellini tends to take a lot longer to get ready than I do, so he's probably going to give me about a solid hour here just to do his hair. So my wife Liz, who's also a veterinarian, I think you've seen in a couple of episodes, she also did an internship. And Liz, would you like to sum up what an internship is like in 5 words or less, maybe?
It is very terrible.
That'll be good.
But also, it was good. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I learned 10% of what I know from vet school and 90% from my internship.
That is true. So it's very terrible, but it helps you and you do learn a lot.
Exactly.
All right, so you're in vet school, you've managed to get in, and a year or 2 from finishing, you're surviving, you're doing the best you can, and you're thinking about doing an internship. Should you? That's the first question to ask. Well, I think the answer to that question is yes and no. But first, before I get into that, let me walk you through what exactly is an internship. So an internship in veterinary medicine is basically a 1-year service education program that you undertake immediately or soon after graduating from veterinary school. So the purpose of a veterinary internship is to provide mentored, experiential, and clinical training for veterinarians seeking to advance their clinical competence. So for most people, this year represents the most challenging year of your professional career by far, up to that point. When you get to a residency, you'll probably think an internship is nothing, but we'll continue that talk in another episode. The reason this is because you're working a tremendous amount of hours, and it's really easy to be overwhelmed by such a high volume of cases during your internship. And everything you see is brand new to you. You've never seen it before, at least in the situation where you're the sole primary doctor. And so by definition, because you're a new doctor and everything's new, you're not going to be as good at taking care of these problems and recognizing them as you would later on in your career, say 10 years later. Combine that experience, that new experience, with the number of hours you're working in, you can see how it would be a really challenging situation. So you apply for internships via a website called the VIRMP, stands for the Veterinary Internship and Residency Matching Program. It's somewhat similar to how in human medicine they have the match. But the website serves to basically match applicants to programs in a similar manner as the human medical match. So an applicant will rank institutions based on their preference. So you go to interview at different places, you go to visit these clinics and hospitals, and you get a good idea as far as where you would like to work. And after you've visited a few, you can then rank them on the website 1 through however many you want to rank, and basically say, okay, what is my preference of where I'd like to go? So an applicant will rank institutions based on their preference, and institutions will rank applicants based on their preference after they've interviewed them. And each year around, I think it's February or March every year, the results of the match are published by the VIRMP. And it's always an interesting time because you get to find out where you're going to be going for the first year out of veterinary school. But a quick side note, you don't actually have to use the VIRMP for internships. There's tons of internships that are what's called outside of the match, because these institutions don't really like to use the website for whatever reason. And that doesn't make them automatically shady. In fact, there's tons that are outside of the match that are in some ways much better than other internship programs that are inside the match. So now that you know what an internship is, should you do one? That's really the most important question that you should ask yourself. And the answer to that question, like most things in life, it really just depends. So the answer to that question is a definitive yes if you want to pursue a residency and a specialty of any kind. With pretty much any residency, aside from, I think, clinical pathology, almost every residency requires that you do a rotating internship. And many residencies these days will require that you do a specialty internship as well, where you're basically an intern for another year after your first internship, only this time you're spent only on the specialty service. If you want to do an internship because you simply want to be a better doctor and be a more competent vet once you're done, then the answer to that question is a maybe, and I'll explain why. So the reason this is a maybe is because the mentorship you get at an internship isn't always great. And a lot of the time you can just go into private practice and get the same quality of mentorship as an ER doctor or a general practitioner with the other doctors in the hospital. Not always, but a lot of the time you can. And that mentorship can very often be better than what you would get with an internship in general. The difference being, if you're going straight into practice, you're going to make oftentimes 2, 3, or 4 times more during that year, and you're not setting yourself back financially that first year out of veterinary school. That difference in pay is pretty huge between a regular practicing veterinarian and an intern. And this kind of segues into a major issue with internship programs that affects your decision as far as whether or not you want to do one. The biggest problem with internships is that there's effectively zero regulation of internship programs in general. Unfortunately, there's a lot of internship programs that serve purely to have interns as forms of cheap labor. These hospitals are able to pay a licensed veterinarian, an intern, but a licensed veterinarian nonetheless, $30,000 a year or less. And it's under the guise of, oh, we're teaching them. But they really end up not teaching these doctors. And then here's some real talk. Sometimes internships are a total farce. I know that's difficult to acknowledge and that might be deemed as controversial, but trust me, there are internship programs out there who have zero desire to teach you and they do not have your best interests at heart. You are purely there to provide a cost-effective form of labor, and it allows them to essentially make more money off of you by justifying paying you $30,000 a year or less. This is the unfortunate reality of internships, and in my experience, this does not get talked about as much as it should. It's going great. So, fortunately, I've not had this experience, but I do know people that have, and I will say that finding yourself there is an absolute nightmare. This is like the worst possible scenario that you can find yourself in as a person and as a veterinarian, and that is the internship that doesn't care about you. I'll get back to this in a second, and we'll talk about ways that you can avoid finding yourself in that situation. Now back to whether or not you should do one. If you want to do an internship because you'll think you'll make more money long term, the answer to that is no. You probably won't. Studies have actually shown that doctors who do an internship but don't pursue a residency do not make more money than doctors who did not do an internship and just went straight into practice long term. So the idea that I'll do an internship and it'll make me a better doctor and then I'll be able to have a higher earning potential long term is just not true. All right, so you've looked into internships, you've decided that you want to do one. How do you then apply for an internship? Well, it's actually pretty easy. During veterinary school, generally in the 3rd or the 4th year, you'll set up an account on the website, and from there you can look up different programs and see what their criteria are for applicants. And they share some commonalities, things like letters of recommendation and transcripts and things like that. But there's some differences in some there. You just have to do basically what they say in their application requirements. So it's actually pretty easy and streamlined. So for GPA, just like undergrad, you have to just keep it as high as you possibly can. And it's just basic stuff. It's the same stuff that you would do in undergrad, like time management, trying to focus in class, not getting distracted, maybe not going out to parties and getting drunk on a Friday night like maybe your friends want to do, just stuff like that. Just you got to remind yourself you're in professional school, you're paying a lot of money to be here, and your career really depends, maybe not entirely, but a lot on what you're doing in school and how you're preparing. So as far as GPA goes, at least in my experience, really the cutoff, kind of the minimum requirement that most internship programs will have is a 3.0. If your GPA is below a 3.0, most places really just won't consider you because they have a number of applicants and they have to have some sort of an initial screening tool to let them know, hey, we're only considering people above or and not below this threshold. So if your GPA is below a 3, most places really won't consider you and they'll throw out your application. Not every place, but that's just the reality of it. However, many places are okay with the low GPA as long as you're either 1, able to explain why, or 2, your letters of recommendation, your clinical experience, etc. can make up for it. Basically, if 1 or more people vouch for you, you can overcome it. And I know many interns, including myself, over the years whose GPA was low due to various reasons, but they still got internships either in or outside of the MASH because of these reasons. So for letters of recommendation, your best place to go by far is faculty at your veterinary school. Faculty is a great resource because these are typically very well regarded, very highly respected doctors in our field in different specialties. And so a letter from them is basically saying like an expert vouches for you. And the best way to get a letter from these faculty members is to stand out and get their attention and really just hustle. That's really the biggest thing. Attributes like good interpersonal skills, eagerness to learn, being proactive, taking interest in your cases, being really thorough and researching them, working well with animals, showing compassion for animals and for pet owners, willingness to help techs and support staff. All of these things are kind of common sense things that you should be doing and should be kind of thinking about. But if you demonstrate this, these sorts of qualities will really stand out to anybody who's looking to vouch for you and write you a letter of recommendation. So just to review, GPA and letters of recommendation are the first 2 things when you're applying for an internship. The third thing to consider during your internship is your letter of intent. This is the letter you write that says why I want to be an intern, why I want to work at this certain facility, why I want to be this type of a specialist, all these sorts of different things. This is pretty straightforward and it's not dissimilar from your application to get into veterinary school in the first place. The general principles still apply. You want to describe why you want to do an internship, what your goals are after an internship, like say if you want to be a specialist of a certain type, and why you would be a good intern. Again, if your GPA is below a 3 or you think it's just kind of low in general, I would recommend explaining that somehow in your letter at this point. You need to explain, not too long, I wouldn't spend the entire letter doing it, but I would definitely acknowledge within like 2 to 4 sentences in your letter why your GPA is what it is and the circumstances that led to that. And just be honest about it. In my letter, I was very open about my GPA and the reasons why, what it was, which is perhaps a video for another day. And I was open about it to the faculty members I asked for letters of recommendation from, and they worked with me a bit, and they saw that I was a very hard worker. I was very easy to get along with. I made friends with everybody that I worked with, all the support staff and my fellow students, and they saw that I was going to be and had the potential to be a good doctor one day, and they had no qualms about writing me a letter. So I think the lesson to be learned from that is that I didn't hide from it, and you shouldn't either if you're in that boat. You should simply acknowledge your faults and demonstrate that you want to improve and move forward from that. This is just kind of like standard growth as a person. The fourth thing to consider and prepare for during your internship is the interview itself. This is a very tricky thing to prepare for because there's no book and there's no class that you take in vet school about like how to interview. And everybody interviews people differently. A private practice internship program, that practice owner is going to interview you a lot differently sometimes than say like somebody in academia, like a dean or something like that. They prioritize different things when they interview people. So you're never going to know exactly what they're going to want to hear from you. In general, I would not expect to be drilled on some specific disease and have to memorize like things like your board exam. You're not having to study for any sort of exam. The questions that you would get asked would be very kind of like broad. For instance, a dog who is hit by a car comes in and you notice this, what would you do? And you just need to provide like the first 3 steps of how you would triage an emergency or what you would do for a specific type of emergency. And again, there's not going to be a clear-cut answer, but they're wanting to hear from you how you would walk through this process and how you would evaluate a pet and help take care of them. I would also definitely expect to have curveballs. The most common curveball that you would get during an interview for an internship would be something like, a dog comes in who is hit by a car, what would you do? And then you answer it. And then the interviewer asks, okay, now what would you do if the owner didn't have any money? Something that you don't learn about in veterinary school, right? So be prepared for stuff like that. Be prepared for, hey, I would treat them like this gold standard, but if the owner couldn't afford the gold standard, do I have a plan B? That's really important. And that's a common thing that intern directors and people interviewing you will want to find out. They want to know if you can think on your toes a little bit and kind of improvise in a medically sound way. And this is also an opportunity for you to discuss a low GPA. Again, that issue, if that does apply to you. But generally speaking, the interviewer just simply wants to hear you talk and get a sense for how you are as a person. They want to hear you be optimistic and eager to help and excited to be a doctor. They definitely don't want to hear anything resembling like negativity or frustration or anything about like, I want to just make a lot of money. Common sense stuff, but again, the number one thing you don't want to do is send off red flags about your personality or being negative or being difficult to work with or demanding, all those sorts of things. A huge red flag is entitlement. For some reason, there's a tiny number of vet students that come out with a little bit of what can be deemed entitlement, meaning they think they don't have to help support staff, they think they don't have to see certain cases. That's probably one of the biggest red flags that you can send off during your interview. So, I mean, in general, don't act like that. Don't be entitled in any way, shape, or form. Or don't project anything during your interview that would remotely have a chance of you being seen as entitled in any way, shape, or form. So finally, here's some tidbits that are a little bit specific for you to help you during your internship application and things to consider. So I spoke with some vet friends of mine who are currently intern directors at various private practices and universities across the country because I wanted to get a sense for this video as far as what they specifically ask applicants for internship interviews. And here's some examples that they gave me. One, what kind of cases are your favorite? What are your least favorite? This is also a difficult question to answer without sounding negative. So if you can navigate how to talk about your least favorite medical case without sounding negative, like, oh, I just don't want to see it, talk about like how you would work through your least favorite type of thing. And I mentioned this before, but a lot of interviewers are going to want to know how you would treat a specific case if the owner had financial limitations and couldn't afford the gold standard. Another question that came up on more than one occasion was, how would you handle a client who yelled at you or was difficult or called you names and was rude, or said that you're just in it for the money? That's a common thing that some owners will ask if they get upset with you. So overall, the interview process is a tricky one to prep for, but if you just keep two things in mind, you'll be fine. The first is any question that anybody asks you medically about a medical problem, always, always, always prioritize what's best for the animal or the pet. Always keep that in mind. That is the beacon that you should always strive for, not only as a interviewee, but as a veterinarian in general. Like that's always the goal, is just do what's best for the pet, always. And secondly, be open and honest about anything you're not sure of. If you don't know an answer to a specific question during an interview, just say, look, I'm not really totally sure. I've never seen that case before. It's not unheard of. I mean, you're just a student at that time. You haven't seen hardly anything because your career hasn't really even started yet from a professional standpoint. So you're not going to know, everything. And if you don't know something, just say, look, I don't know, but I am eager to look it up and try to find the answer to that. And once I see it and can kind of get some experience in working with it, then I'll be good to go from there. Nobody's going to expect you to just know everything right off the bat, having never seen it before. So one final thing, and this gets back to the whole issue of programs wanting to use you for forms of cheap labor. During an interview, if you're about to go to an internship, always, always, always speak to at least 3 interns who have recently graduated from this program. Ideally, these would be interns in the last year, kind of the year that's about to leave and you're about to come in and take their place. Maybe at most 2 or 3 years removed from the program. The reason you want to talk to these people and get in touch with them is because they will be able to give you the most accurate information and behind the scenes knowledge of the program in general. You need to figure out that the program is a good place to work and harbors a good, safe, mentally healthy work environment and not a total nightmare scenario like I mentioned before. The best way to do that is talking to former interns who have been through this program recently. Oftentimes, these nightmare programs will present themselves as something that they're totally not. It's absolutely insane, but it does happen, believe it or not. And so you have to make sure that you're not going to a place that's going to be, frankly, abusive towards you. And even then, unfortunately, it doesn't guarantee that you'll avoid these sorts of places. There's a severe problem in our field where sometimes prior interns still won't tell you the real truth about a program. It's like some weird Stockholm syndrome or something like that going on in veterinary medicine. But basically, nobody wants to be labeled as a complainer in any way. So nobody wants to speak the truth about how bad and how toxic some of these programs can be. So you have to talk to multiple interns, and that's why I always recommend talking to at least 3 to get a true sense. And if you get a really different story from the first intern